Hello, thanks for joining the session this afternoon. My name is Rolf Strietholt and I'm with the IEA, the organization that is conducting these international assessments. And today I would like to present you some research that connects very well to what we just heard. And I would like to thank the organizers of the conference because, as you will see, I think these different presentations complement each other quite nicely. So now you've seen something on what has happened in Italy. And I will also refer briefly to Italy, but I will also talk about the international situation in different countries. But I will try to shed some light on what countries have done during the pandemic. So how have countries responded to the pandemic? What kind of measures have they implemented? How did students feel during the pandemic? I will not talk about effects, but what I would talk about is inequalities, in particular how were the educational opportunities, how were the differences for different student groups. Okay. Does it work? Yeah. So before I start, I would like to share with you that this is a joint work together with my colleagues. Sabine Meinck is over there in the audience, and Julian Fraillon cannot be here with us today, but we were editing together the report of this study, and I will tell you in a minute about the publication and where you will find more about the study that was conducted a year ago. Published. We just published the international report a couple of months ago. Good. So what can we learn from the responses to educational disruptional survey rates? Let me first start briefly with the motivation to conduct this study. So, as we heard, COVID-19 has severely impacted educational systems and the outcomes. There are now several studies out that have shown that. And so why are there these differences in achievement and performance? What has changed? And I think that there's a great need for evidence to understand what countries did in the different countries, because something must have caused this learning loss that were observed. What is it exactly? What we heard already, schools were closed for significant periods of time. In Italy, what we found it was up to 1 year in total when you put together the figures from the different years. And that was not only the case in Italy, but in many other countries. However, that doesn't mean that students didn't learn during this period, but there was massive investments into distance learning with the aid of digital devices and information and computer technology. So whenever possible, countries tried to continue learning, but just in a different way. And obviously, this didn't really make up for the physical teaching within the schools and classrooms. The UNESCO estimated that this is really a global phenomenon where 90% of all students in school were affected. Now, the IEA comes into play. We observed this, and we thought that there is a great need to monitor what is going on in the different countries, and ideally, countries could also learn from each other. Because there are different ways how to respond to school closures. I mean, first you can close schools for shorter or longer periods, and this is what we observe internationally, but also how students continue learning then during these closures. Now, this slide here, I think I can skip because we had a brilliant summary of the research conducted in Italy already, and we just saw some new evidence. Basically what we put it together is, I think, the evidence for the learning loss that was observed in several studies, and there was also some evidence that there is inequalities in terms of socioeconomic status, of gender, and so forth. And this is just a snapshot of the research conducted for Italy, but there's of course similar evidence for other countries. The next slide I can also almost skip because you provide first side insights on this. as we heard before, Italy was not that well prepared for distance learning, for digital learning, because what we observed in an earlier study that was conducted before the pandemic in 2018, the International Computer and Information Literacy Study, what was observed there is that the Italian students did not perform that well in computer literacy, and information and computer technology was not very much used by teachers before. I mean, you can now think if it's good or bad to have this digital learning, but obviously it became more important during the pandemic when there was just no opportunity to have students in the school. So information, the role of information and computer technology has changed during the pandemic. Another important finding that we found in our other studies in TIMSS in 19, just before the pandemic, was that many teachers in Italy reported a need for professional development. So they expressed that they need to know more about computer use for teaching, but less than 30% compared to 80% that reported this need actually participated in professional development in these things. So altogether this was the Italian setting before the pandemic. But let me now continue with our RED study. So what happened during the pandemic? REDS is an international large-scale survey. We did not administrate any tests, but the aim of this study was during the pandemic collecting information of what's going on in educational systems worldwide. So we conceptualized this study, a questionnaire survey on learning during COVID-19. We are focusing in the study on secondary education, grade 8, and altogether 11 countries participated, and we had a great variation. We will hear more on one particular country during this session, but we had different countries from different regions throughout the world, different levels of development, and so forth. You will see the composition in a minute. Altogether, we surveyed more than 1,500 principals, more than 15,000 teachers, and more than 21,000 students all around the world, applying rigorous sampling strategies and having standardized procedures for the collection of the data. In addition, I didn't mention it here, we also collected some national level data to put things into context, to understand national policies and so forth. Yeah, and we're really happy that we were able to publish a first findings report of this data earlier this year in May. The main results from the main descriptive report, or main results on different themes related to COVID-19, that is the impact of the pandemic on teaching and learning, communication, feedback and assessment that took place during the pandemic, help and support that was provided to students and to teachers and to schools around the world, and then an important dimension was also well-being. So how did this social component, how did students perceive the situation during COVID? And then we also try to address the issue of the transition back to school, and we try to administrate some items on whether the changes were persisting or not. I mean, this massive investments into computerized learning, for example, or the computer-aided learning, were they used after the pandemic as well. And it was very complicated because the survey took place right during the pandemic. And I mean, we are here together right now in this room, but it's difficult to determine whether this will change or not. And 1 year ago, when this data was collected, we were facing the same problems. I mean, we didn't know where we are going, and so we're constantly trying to adjust the instruments and the surveys until the actual data collection. But as you can imagine, that was preparing something and shooting on a moving target. However, then there was other things like the perceived academic progress, which is kind of a proxy of how the students felt, whether they could continue learning or not during the pandemic. And then we had an overall measure of the preparedness for future disruptions. So we thought it would be good to ask students, would you be prepared for future disruptions? And that is something we heard this morning in one of the presentations. I think it's quite likely that there will be other disruptions due to climate change and extreme weather conditions or issues like war that we are experiencing right now. So I think that this study can also inform policy for future disruptions that may not be related to a pandemic, but to other things. Yes, and then lastly, we were studying inequalities in educational opportunity, and that is the topic that I would like to elaborate on a little further during this presentation and give you some insights into to what we've studied here with a focus on inequality. Before I forget to mention that, the report that you see right now, it is freely available on our website, so if you're interested in this study, and I don't want to forget about mentioning this, you can just go and on the IEA website, you will find this report, and you can continue reading if you're interested in this. Okay, why studying inequality? Just the background, inclusive and equitable education is a central component on an international level, like reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, but also guiding the academic discourse on education worldwide. We focus here on COVID-19 and inequalities related to the pandemic, and here we follow the extensive literature on group differences in educational opportunity, initiated perhaps by the Coleman report. We considered 3 categories of inequality. One is gender-related inequalities, so gender gaps. The second is socioeconomic gaps. And the third is the rural-urban divide, which is also widely studied and also important in an Italian context, as we just learned. So these and other dimensions of inequality have also been studied before. So this is also in line with the tradition on how we study education in international comparative studies. The samples that we used, the data here in reds was based on representative samples, or on random samples from the countries. They may not all be representative. I will talk about that in a minute, because it was quite challenging to collect data, and it was not always easy to approach all schools. So it's often it was just impossible to get in touch with schools, teachers, and students. However, we did, as I said, a student survey, but some countries decided not to participate in the student survey since they felt that it was impossible at the time when the study was administrated to administrate the student survey. And that is why I have to limit the analysis and the results that I will present to you in a minute to these 8 countries. As you can see, it's still quite some variation. We have Burkina Faso, Denmark, Ethiopia, Kenya, the Russian Federation, Slovenia, UAE, and Uzbekistan. These are the 8 countries. The 3 dimensions of inequality that we studied. First, socioeconomic status. We constructed an index, which is kind of a measure of the socioeconomic status, by combining information on the number of books at home, parental education, occupation. And then within each country, we divided the sample into low SES group and a high SES group. So just for the sake of simplicity to report gaps between low and high, and we made a split so that we had in each country roughly 50% low SES, 50% high SES. For gender, we compare the gap between males and females, and for rural, urban, we made here a divide between rural areas, and these were up to 50,000 inhabitants, and urban, that is then defined as cities with more than 15,000 inhabitants. And that was kind of a compromise so that we could distinguish in all different countries that I just mentioned these two groups. And yeah, I mean, for each country you could criticize or discuss whether these are appropriate thresholds, but we wanted to have some comparability there. Yeah, and then we studied educational opportunity, and that is based on the different contents that were captured, or the different topic areas, thematic areas that we surveyed in our study. And here we used the student-reported measures on the family life, on well-being. Family life became very important during the pandemic. Well-being, student anxiety about their education careers, and their readiness for learning. I made a couple of indicators. What I will present today is individual items. So we didn't construct scales, but this is now all based on individual items, and they were all measured on a frequency or Likert scale. And we always split then the responses into agreement and disagreement, for example. So that just for the to ease the presentation. Yeah, well, and this is the first topic that we studied. There was a change in the learning and living spaces, homeschooling and home office. You remember probably, or in particular those with kids, that kids had to learn at homes, and the family life was then affected in such a way that not only the kids couldn't go to school, but also their parents didn't go to work anymore, but they worked from home. And this mobile work, of course, had also consequences because the parents could watch their kids what they were doing in case that they were allowed to work from home, which was not possible for all kids because the parents in some professions had to go and to continue if they were working in a supermarket, in the health sector, and so forth. So students were then simply asked if their parents were working outside their homes, and that was the simple question if one or both was at home. And when I will now show you the results, here in this table you will see the proportion of students who reported that their parents worked from home by low and high SES groups. And furthermore, you will also see that for, by gender and by region. And then we are summarizing, and I think I would like to draw your attention to these little bars here because they indicate the gap between the two groups related to the three categories, social categories. What you will see here is that we divide the table into two sections. In the upper part we have countries with very high participation rates that fulfilled all normal IEA standards. And then we have, on the other hand, the countries that were not able to adhere to these fairly high standards that we have with the IEA. So here the data may not be representative of the target population. I mean, the fact that we present that illustrates or shows that we have some confidence, but I just felt like it's important to reflect that. And that's also why we, for these countries that we were not sure that they really do, that this is not really representative, we didn't report here standard errors. That's the reason why you don't see them here. But I mean, roughly you get an idea about what is significant from the upper part of this table. So what do we learn? Firstly, we observed that there is a great deal of variance between different countries in terms of the share of parents working from home. And the share is quite small in some countries, but much larger in others. And I think this is a general finding, but this is something you will see throughout the next slides as well. This is not what I want to focus on right now. I focus on this inequality gaps, and what you see then, in particular, large gaps were observed for SES, for the socioeconomic status. And what we see here is that in the Russian Federation, for example, 42% of the parents were working from home for high SES kids, but this was only the case for 28% of the low SES families. So there was a huge gap. So these parents that were well off, or kids from parents that were well off, their parents were accessible at the homes when the kids couldn't go to school. And this is something that we observe not only in the Russian Federation but also in other countries, and the differences, as you see here, can be huge. They amount to up to a difference of 30 points in Slovenia. Interestingly, though, we do not observe these gaps for gender and region. There the differences are much smaller. So a second topic that we studied was well-being, and we thought that the closure of schools did not only have direct effects on the learning, but students also had less opportunity to socialize with their peers, with their friends. And we thought that this is also important for the overall well-being and then eventually also for learning, as these things interact. And here an important component of well-being was a measure of loneliness, and we asked students, the question or the statement was administrated, I felt more lonely than usual during the COVID-19 disruption, and these are the results for this item. As you see, altogether the gaps are much smaller. So while we observe a large proportion of students that reported this feeling of loneliness, we see only small differences in terms of SES groups by gender or by region. This doesn't hold for all countries. There are some exceptions where we observe larger gaps, for example by gender in Denmark. But in total, what you see is that the differences are much smaller compared to the result that I just presented a second ago. So this is loneliness. A third topic that we studied was the worriedness about falling behind, and here we ask students whether they felt that they fall behind in their learning compared to other kids. And again, then we summarize the results here. And what we observe is that there is now again quite some evidence for inequalities in terms of SES and gender and region that we observe across all countries. For SES, this pattern is quite clear. The low SES kids report this fear of falling behind much more frequently than kids that are privileged. In terms of region, we observe in particular in Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Kenya, but also to a somewhat smaller extent than in Denmark, that kids in rural areas were more concerned about falling behind. And then for gender, interestingly, the patterns were quite different. So in some countries that went in one direction, and in other countries in another direction. Yeah, how did students feel prepared for self-directed learning? Self-directed learning was particularly important during distance learning, and as I said before, it is quite possible or even likely that there may be future disruptions, and so we asked students how they feel about being prepared for that, the future disruptions. So the question was, overall, how prepared do you feel for learning from home if your school building closed for an extended period in the future? And then they said, like, not well prepared, to very prepared, very well prepared. And here again, we found a very clear picture for the socioeconomic status, mimicking what we just observed before. So the preparedness was higher for those that were in our high SES group, and that was a consistent finding across all countries, and the differences were up to 20% points, so that was quite a bit. And then again for the region, the rural-urban divide, we observed something similar again, that in several countries students in urban regions felt better prepared than in rural regions. For gender, the differences, however, were small and again a little more diverse. So, what can we conclude? I think the key finding of our analysis is that there are inequalities in education opportunity and that it's worth studying them, that we need further information on that. Overall, I think the differences between countries, that's obviously, well, much larger than the differences within countries. However, we observed some gaps, and they could be extremely big for some of the items, but not for everything, and not for all social categories. So what we observed was, for example, that the socioeconomic disadvantaged students were more likely to express fear and falling behind than privileged children. And there, this was a very consistent finding, and the differences were rather large across all countries. Working from home, on the other hand, which is a completely different item, was more common for the socioeconomically advantaged parents. So there the kids had someone at their homes to take care of them, to watch them, potentially also to support them. Something that was not the case, or to a small extent, for the not so well-off kids. And similar differences were also observed between urban and rural areas in favor of the urban areas. Good, and that is just in a very condensed way what we found in our study. Thank you very much for your attention.